here today speaking with you about a topic that I'm particularly interested in, and I hope that you get some real value out of this. At the end of the presentation, I will give you my personal email address, actually, so that if you'd like to reach out to me afterwards or sometime in the near future, you are more than welcome to. I've met a number of people through these webinars and design casts that things have worked out quite nicely just in terms of helping people long beyond the actual presentation. So feel free to reach out to me. It's only an email. It can't hurt anything. So let's just start with the basic idea. What's the actual problem? And perhaps you're wondering if there's really a problem at all, although I suspect that you don't feel this way because otherwise you wouldn't be attending this webinar. But after all, many web designers and developers have fantastic relationships and they build incredible websites together. And so that's actually really the goal. That's where we want to get to. Unfortunately, though, this is not hardly always the case, and it's really not that difficult to find situations where creatives and coders are at odds. In particular, I find this is true in like not larger corporations, but any business where it's an internal team, especially when it's you know, it does get to be a little larger and the teams are a little more split up. The adversity between the two can get kind of problematic. So why is it that designers and developers can't really see eye to eye? After all, don't we all have the same basic goal to build ultimately the best site possible? And of course we do. But there really is sort of a disconnect somewhere that keeps this from happening. Personally, I think this is most fundamentally all tied down to egos on both sides that ultimately have to be sort of dealt with and tamed. In many industries, we actually see these sorts of dynamics. It's not too hard to find other sort of situations where this happens. The biggest difference with the designer-developer debate is that both sides are really fundamentally equal. So a good example is the doctor-nurse relationship, where the doctor is really the boss usually over the nurse. And it's sort of a different dynamic. I think a really good contrast to the developer-designer relationship is that of, say, a carpenter and an electrician, or any one of the other number of people that help build a building or house or whatever. So in that kind of case, they're both sort of at the same level. They have an important role that goes into the overall product that's being built, and they have this really interdependent relationship. So carpenters, for example, might build things in a certain way that either negatively or positively impacts the electrician. And so there's really sort of this interdependent need of each other, but they also can blame each other in many cases. So ultimately, I really think both sides of the equation here are really equal. Both are equally important. And one huge thing we can do to move forward is to just really acknowledge that and start to see that both sides really play an important role so that we can begin to work together. Now, since we are speaking to designers today, I'm going to address issues that we can do, or things that we can do and things that we can change on our side, since we're not really under the control of, or not in the control of the developers, so to speak. So these are all targeted things for designers to address issues with developers, essentially. So one chart that sort of illustrates this problem has made the rounds on the web here recently, and it's this fun little chart that describes itself as the war between developers, designers, and project managers. Of course, we're not going to talk about project managers, but they are obviously an important part of this. I love that the designers see themselves as superstar models, and the developers see themselves as brilliant scientists discovering things, and their views of each other is perhaps less than ideal, which you can see here. One thinks they're babies and the other thinks they're big oafs sitting around fixing computers. So it's not perhaps the best perspective to have of each other, and I think that if we can escape this mindset, then we will only do ourselves some good. So let's back up just one more step here and say, why should we even want to work together? Like, why should we bother? What's the point? And I've kind of got some quick ideas here, but I think fundamentally the benefits are really actually pretty huge. First among these, in my mind, is just basic efficiency. With improved relations and better working together, we can waste less time. And at the end of the day, this means more profit if you're doing client-based work, or just faster and more effective timelines if you're an internal team building products that way. So whatever the case, improved efficiency will be a good thing. Also, if you do your part to improve this relationship, the end result is most likely going to be greater control on the actual end product. So if you're tired of looking at a website that your company built and you notice all sorts of things that the developer didn't quite get right, well, I think that improving these relationships ultimately will allow you to have greater control, which will ultimately lead to better websites. And so big aspect, I think, out of trying to be more efficient and kind of create a better workflow, I think you ultimately will grow out of this. I think you'll become a more knowledgeable person on how things are done, and ultimately this really leads to an increased value. If you're a person that injects positive movement into a team and you increase efficiency, increase profit margins, and just overall are a good dynamic element of a team, you'll be worth more money. And so the place you're at should hopefully recognize this on some level, but definitely moving into the future, you'll be able to carry that forward, and this will be something that definitely benefits you over the long haul. And ultimately, really, this impacts the final product, and the whole idea is to make better, sharper, more beautiful websites, and the more we work together, the more likely that is to happen. So why do I personally care? I tend to be maybe more of a developer than a designer, but I also went to design school, so I definitely have learned both sides, and I certainly talk about design a lot. I write books about it and do all these sorts of things. It's something I'm definitely very passionate about, but I do tend to fall more on the developer side. So actually, I've been on both sides of this debate. For one, I've experienced just how painful it can be when a design team doesn't want to plan or accommodate for the fundamentals of the web. Sorry, I had to cough there for a second. And when designers' egos really can sometimes rule the roost, and how something is actually going to be built seems like more of a mere consequence of their design brilliance. So that's sort of one side of the fence. And on the other, I've also witnessed just how terrible it can be when a bullheaded developer derails a project by objecting to everything, blaming lousy designs, or just simply stalling a project out of sheer stubbornness. And oftentimes the developers kind of work in a black hole. The creatives and sometimes a lot of the management don't really understand what's actually being done. And this is particularly true of internal teams that build sort of support systems. The management may not understand the world of web development, and so it's easy for the web developers to sort of hide and really kind of derail things just out of sheer stubbornness. Like if they don't like a feature or whatever, they just kill it by not doing it and delaying it. And the confession part of this, unfortunately, is that I've actually been both of these at one point, especially the obnoxious developer when I first started off. So I've seen firsthand just how horrible it can be. In fact, in one environment, I really managed to alienate the entire design team, a mistake that ultimately made it really impossible to accomplish anything of significance. So it was really detrimental to the whole thing. And so I've seen just how horrible this dysfunction can really be. But at the same time, I've managed over the years to get to a better spot, and now I've actually had the privilege of working with teams where the relationship was quite positive, and the end result was undoubtedly some of the best work that I've ever been a part of. And so I've seen both sides of this, and I'm really quite interested in helping people move forward on this. So let's dig into the first one here. This first suggestion here, if you will, is rather simple. It's likely something you maybe do to some degree. You at least know that you should be doing it, and perhaps you do sometimes, perhaps you don't. But it's something I suggest you revisit and just make sure you're doing the best that you can in. Most fundamentally, this really just comes down to using built-in features inside of Photoshop or Fireworks or whatever tool you're using to organize your files. This starts with things like using layer groups, using the built-in notes feature, deleting unneeded layers, and then finally just naming those layers of your file so that they make sense. If you're feeling really sort of energetic about this, you can even color code those layers to where maybe use the same color scheme through different comps or just inside of one comp, however that might work. So I think the best sort of rule of thumb here is if you're working on your file and you find it difficult to locate things, then your developer is going to be having the same trouble when they go to cut this up. So when they convert your design to code, they're going to be showing and hiding things so that they can slice it up into various images to be converted to code. And so as they show and hide things, if they're not grouped logically, sometimes things can get inadvertently turned off. So a simple example is you have a layer group for maybe a button element, but then you have one kind of color adjustment layer or something sort of in a separate layer group by accident. Well, they may hide that other layer group, and now all of a sudden the output doesn't match what you really intended. And so it can just get really confusing. In other cases, just with unneeded layers that should have been deleted can really confuse things. So this is an example from my own history. I did this file years ago. I just pulled it out because it was such a mess. And you can see here, you can't even tell what you don't know what it's supposed to even be. It's a total mess. In fact, yeah, I have no idea what it was even from now that I'm looking at it without having seen it for a little while. This was just for me though, so it didn't really matter. I wasn't handing it off, but this is not what your file should look like. And as a developer, I've received many a file like that, and they are never any fun to work with because you don't know if these hidden layers are supposed to be there or not. It's just a total disaster. In contrast, here is a brilliantly organized file, and they've used the color coding, they've named the layer groups and everything. So as a developer, this is a dream to work on. So it's not, in this case, about sort of catering to your developer just to ultimately, make their life easier. That's not the goal here. Certainly, there's nothing wrong with helping out your coworkers, but the end goal here is efficiency, quality of work, and accuracy in terms of replicating your design. And so if you kind of give them the right tools to work with, the end product will always be better for it. So it can actually be really annoying to invite a developer to a meeting regarding a new website or any kind of development that's going underway, because a lot of times if the relationship's already sour, you're going to get lots of, no, we can't do that, or they'll just groan about every idea you have, or basically be a wet blanket to the entire thing and sort of kill everything before it even can get anywhere. So I know this is difficult, but regardless of this, I really suggest you start doing this on some level. Maybe not to every meeting, but to some degree start drawing the developers in earlier in the process. So of course doing this at first is really going to be painful, but eventually I think you have sort of a number of benefits. One of these is that if you do have a developer that's just constantly saying no, there's could be many reasons for this. One, they might just be not very skilled or not as versed as you would like them to be, and so that will kind of expose that. Or maybe they're just frustrated by the situation, or maybe they've just, not been a part of the sales process. Sometimes just exposing the developers or the people who see the site last to the actual original business needs or the original client request can really alleviate a lot of pressure, because that way when the designer hands the design over, the developer knows why certain decisions were made, because sometimes you have to make decisions or set up things in ways that are either less than ideal or not exactly what you would really hope for. And it's almost always because of some specific request or business need or client demand, whatever it is. So getting them in there early can really help with that. In the long haul, as you sort of get used to doing this and you have them be a natural part of things, they can be a huge benefit to things. For example, they can help you identify tremendous budget problems, like maybe you have some feature or need that you didn't quite know when you first sold it and you got the kind of technical approval, but now you're designing it, you're realizing you need something. They can help you identify those problems and how they might kill your budget. They can also be a real asset in terms of providing kind of brainstorming and inspiration, just because they know how to actually build things. So sometimes they'll look at a problem and recognize kind of creative solutions to things that you might not have thought of based on tools that they know how to use or whatever. So there can really be some huge perks to definitely working together. In fact, I think you'll find some of the most popular sites that people talk about the most and rave about the most really display a true integration of design and code in terms of just sort of leveraging things to the maximum potential that they can be. And you can't get there unless the technical team is a part of your design process to some degree. They don't have to be overlooking your comps all the time, but at sort of key stages they should definitely be involved. So another thing that may seem fairly obvious, but there's actually some tremendous benefits to it to keep in mind, is the use of a grid system. This will, of course, not only improve your actual design, but it can actually really streamline the design and, in particular, the development process. So a perfect example of something that really just comes across to developers as careless is when you design a widget or element for a page, then reuse that same widget with only slightly different dimensions elsewhere. So for example, you have a call to action bucket maybe on your home page that the same sort of element is then repeated in the sidebar of a content section of the site. But when it's repeated, it's all of a sudden maybe 20 pixels wider. Maybe it's a little bigger to fill a different space. This ultimately means the developer is going to have to build the same thing twice and have to manage it moving forward. So maybe the images are slightly different, or maybe they have to cut up the same sort of visual element multiple times. So this like really multiplies the work for a very minimal benefit, if you will. So instead, if you use a grid system in those cases, it would really encourage or force you to kind of keep within certain column structures and then ultimately to repeat that same element. So the end result in that case, if the elements are the same size, would be reusable and portable code that really saves the developer a ton of time and ultimately obviously increases the margin and profit. This is not to mention that it makes the site more manageable over the long haul because you don't have the same thing built multiple times. You have it in one way, one place, so that if you have to update it, you can kind of do that in a lot more efficient and effective way. Another sort of unseen aspect of this really is that it sort of demonstrates a respect towards the developer's time. If you're designing things and you just have minor variations just so that it sort of fits, then I think you really have to reconsider how you're designing that because it does waste so much time. And so if we can work those things in, and you can demonstrate to the developer these sort of intentions, then it starts to build a much more positive relationship where you're working together for sort of the maximum results that you can achieve. So a website here that makes use of a grid system to lay things out. It's, I believe, 6 columns here that are combined in multiple ways. And you can see in the top left is the smaller image is the home page. In the background there is the subsequent page. And you can see that the thumbnail with the title and the who built it along with the sort of ratings, that little module is repeated verbatim in the same size, just in a different sort of configuration in terms of how many it is wide over there on the sub page. You can see many elements here that obviously echo each other, and the grid system really just creates a much more consistent feel. So it might have been tempting in that sub page to have the right column be narrower, like maybe 2/3 of the width, and then all of a sudden you'd have maybe one column of photos, which will ultimately create a different size. Just creates all kinds of sort of maintenance issues, not to mention just the time to build it. So there's a ton of efficiency there. And it ultimately makes this site super flexible. The column structure actually adds a lot of value in terms of making portable elements. So if you're interested in learning more about grid systems, this is one of the better ones, the 960 grid system. It does include, it provides all the CSS and stuff, but I think more interestingly, it provides Photoshop templates for producing comps based on this grid system. So even if your developer doesn't want to use a grid system, because to be honest, like personally, I don't actually like the code produced by these. I wouldn't mind laying out a website based on one, but I prefer, maybe more semantic code with less of the extra bits that a grid system like this includes. So there's definitely people on both sides of the fence. So it doesn't really matter if the developer is even going to use this particular grid system, even if you design on it, because the benefits of your of the effects on your design will benefit them regardless of how they're actually going to build it. So don't feel like you have to sell your development team on something like this. The grid system can start with the design, and they can benefit from it without you having to actually insist that they use it. So number 4 here is learn some code. Learn to write some code yourself. So it's a tremendous step that you can take that will not only improve the relationship with your developers, but it's really going to add some market value to yourself. It's become more and more common, obviously, for designers to take on coding elements, especially on the front end, including HTML and CSS. And there's some people that have different opinions on this. Some believe designers shouldn't have to code anything at all, that that should just be programmers sort of taking on that role, while others think that front-end development should be done by the designers who create the original design so that it can stay as true as possible to the original design. So there's definitely both sides. I tend to fall on the you should learn a little bit of code. And you don't necessarily have to learn how to be a master coder or anything. Even just getting really good with HTML and CSS doesn't take a whole lot of work. They're not even real programming languages. They're not. There's no like logic to them other than understanding how the markup itself works. So there's no like programming logic that you have to kind of take into account. If you do get pretty good at that, the next logical thing would be to add JavaScript on there, which obviously is a client-side programming language that it essentially modifies HTML and CSS on the fly. So those would be the three components if you were interested in sort of pursuing this. If you do, you ultimately will have a far better understanding of the impact of your design and how things are actually going to be built. So you'll understand when you make design decisions if it means that something might be difficult to code or if it'll be problematic or that sort of thing. And this will really just lead to better communications between you and your developer as you work together instead of against each other at times. So this can really help break some of the mentality of, you know, I'm just going to design what's most beautiful and you can figure out how to build it. Well, if you learn a little bit of code, you'll start to design accommodating for certain coding practices. And it doesn't cheapen the design. It just helps you understand really the limits that you're working with. So I would actually recommend you work with your development team to get started on this. Let them know that you're interested in learning a little bit so that you can really design more effectively. Maybe what resources or tools would they have that could really help you kind of get started in this. And that way, they can point you to things that are most relevant to the work that they're doing. So they know what they're kind of building and stuff like that. So they know the tools or types of code that would be most helpful for you to learn if you're really going to actually learn something that would be relevant. So in the end, another nice little benefit of this is that it'll help you know when to stand your ground. You'll know when a developer is just stonewalling you or when it's actually a legitimate problem. You'll learn, try to code some things. You'll understand why putting rounded corners, drop shadows, and gradients, and all kinds of patterns and things all together in one little space can be a bit of a problem. So it's not impossible. You just have to understand sort of what the limitations are and how it all kind of plays together. So one of my favorite resources for this is the Web Design Toot site. They offer good insights into design and accommodating for the web. It's not real code-centric, so it's good for that. Another one of my favorite resources that definitely gets into code and breaks things down is the Book Apart books. And they're intended for designers, some of them, like the HTML5 for web designers. And these are fantastic tools to really get you up to speed on technologies so that you can really start to speak the language and know what's going on. It can really help with that. Another resource would be on the How Interactive Design site. We've got a whole CSS3 series to break things down there. So there's plenty of resources that are maybe designer friendly. I know the development world can be a bit daunting, but those are definitely some good places to start where you shouldn't feel overwhelmed immediately. So if you do start to learn some code, it really won't be too hard to start providing some actual code to your developers. At times, this might just mean making a real quick, simple prototype of something, perhaps to demonstrate how something will work, how it'll maybe animate, or sort of what CSS styles that you might be using to achieve the particular effect that you're looking for. And so this could just sort of be a real way to just sort of cut to the chase so that they know exactly what you're looking for. In other situations, you might simply provide them with just some sample websites to look at, but even better along the lines of this is you might provide them a resource or a tutorial, maybe a jQuery plugin or something that achieves the effect or style or impact that ultimately you're looking for. And so providing them with those actual tools can be powerful. And as you start to learn code, you'll start to be able to recognize and find easier the tools that you need, because as you actually start to learn to code and you do things, you will start to pick up on those key resources yourself, and you'll identify the ones that fit well with your design based on how they look, and then hopefully the developer can then vet them based on the code and if they'll work right. But they may not take your code every time, but at least it really can help illustrate the exact point of what you're looking for, which ultimately leads to a little more control over that final product and making sure that the end site that's built will match exactly what you planned for. So in contrast to learning to code, I think we should all learn to teach some design. If you have a particularly bad situation with developers, I wouldn't necessarily lead with this tactic. It might come across a little wrong, but I think this could really, in the long haul, be a great approach to bridging that gap with your developers. And this doesn't mean you have to set up class or give a webinar or literally create some sort of formal education process. Instead, it can really just be about creating a conversation and an ongoing dialogue about design, and providing them with maybe links to articles about key topics. A great tactic can be to just observe the aspects of your design that the developer seems to struggle with. So maybe an obvious one would be alignment. Maybe when the developer cuts things up, they don't quite always get the alignment right and it drives you crazy. Then you might try to find resources that sort of educate them on this. One of my favorite solutions to this is to loan out your basic design principles book that you got in college to learn about alignment and hierarchy and all those sort of basic elements. Share those with your developers. I've actually been approached by a number of developers over the years that really wanted to know about design. They wanted to understand, they just didn't know where to start. And so with a basic ideas book like that, like a principles of design book, it can be a really effective way to just give them a quick primer on something. And I've actually found that if I want to learn about almost any industry or profession, you can get kind of like an accounting 101 or psychology 101 type book, and you can actually learn a heck of a lot really quickly. You won't be a total expert at it. You won't be able to actually perform the trade, but if you just read an accounting 101 book, you're going to know a heck of a lot more about accounting and be able to speak the language, understand what people are asking for a little better, and those sorts of things. So that's what I think can really happen with your developers, is to encourage them to learn something. So focus on doing small doses and figure out just sort of little ways you can start to feed design information to your developers. Don't sort of keep it all to yourself. Try to train them and teach them what you do. A recent book that's come out, I haven't got my hands on it yet, but the idea of it alone illustrates this perfectly. Design for Hackers. Hackers want to, programmers want to know how to design well. Everybody wants to work on beautiful projects, and so a lot of times developers just can't do it. They don't know how to do it. So helping them is definitely a way to go. This kind of leads to the idea of, don't make the developer design. Don't make them do it. So if you don't want them to ruin your design and you are annoyed with maybe their heavy-handed tactics that you find on their sites that they're building, just don't make them do this. Think ahead, plan ahead, all of the elements, content types, layout structures, everything that a site is going to be, and design for all of those. Don't sort of leave it to them to figure out. Some of the smaller details that this will include will be things like navigation states, form controls like text boxes and buttons and stuff. Form validation, which is something that's easy to overlook, like what happens when somebody submits an invalid form entry, like an invalid email in an email field. What's that going to look like? Status messages are a huge one, like if you successfully submit a form or that sort of thing. Backgrounds, like how is your background going to look when it stretches or scales to a larger screen? And sometimes I'll get a comp where it obviously doesn't just end, and so if you don't plan for that, then the developer is eventually going to have to make a decision to what will happen, and so you can introduce some interesting things. The big one is to really just make sure you plan for all base HTML elements, and so this would be everything like all your main heading tags, your paragraphs, form tags, form elements, list controls like your bulleted list, your numbered list, and all those sorts of things. So just plan for all the base HTML elements, and then a great little extra that few people design for, but would make your developers think you're pretty cool, is to plan the emails that the site's going to build. Almost every site sends an email of some form, and so providing a design for that will kind of provide one of those finishing polishes that not only makes the end product better, but keeps your developer from having to design something on their own. So kind of an approach I mentioned earlier is very applicable here as well. So as your company produces websites or publishes them, go look at the end product and take note of all the things that ended up in the design that you didn't actually design, that somebody else did, and most likely a developer if it wasn't a designer. So note those items and add them to your list of things to look for in the future. So every company, depending on the type of website they produce, will sort of have these different extras, if you will, that need to be planned for. So it can really just help you accommodate for those things over the long haul. So an example of where this maybe didn't happen, contact forms are most definitely not the most glamorous parts of a website. Few people would actually create a design comp for one. And you can see this is a beautiful site. The layout is great. Everything about it, it's like all the little details and extras are accounted for. It's great. But then this contact form just sort of it's just kind of stupid. I mean, I guess it works, but there's something about it that's just lame. And maybe it doesn't matter in this case, but it definitely illustrates the point that nobody sort of planned ahead what should happen if I have a small amount of content like this, or should the address be grouped together, or should these all be spaced out equally? There's so many things that could have been improved. For example, this one has even more content, but even better, it's been laid out in a really nice way with nice hierarchy to it, kind of multiple columns here and all these sorts of things. So I'm sure nobody actually planned this out and designed it per se, but the mechanics were there for the content styles to make this possible, the hierarchy and the heading tags and all those sorts of things. So just a little bit of preparation and planning ahead can go a long way to just add those beautiful extra touches to a website that make it truly awesome. Perhaps one of my biggest personal pet peeves is to just make sure you're finished before you hand over your designs. And by this I mean don't finish the home page and hand it over and have it started to be coded so that you can finish the sub-pages later or something like that. Certainly these sorts of situations maybe have to happen from time to time, but it shouldn't be the norm. And if you do find that this is sort of something that happens on every project, that you sort of string things along slowly to your developer, then I really suggest you either kind of challenge the workflow or challenge the timelines, or there's something breaking down. You should be able to create a complete package of designs before handing it over. And doing so, like stringing things along like this, really is quite destructive to the development process. You don't get the benefit as the developer of creating any sort of efficiency because you can't look ahead and see what might happen later on. You sort of have to do this in a bubble and hope that things kind of work effectively as you get the other designs. Even worse is, as you design those subpages or other content areas, it's quite likely that some of those changes might result in maybe navigational changes or something as the site kind of grows into itself. And that can ultimately just really waste a lot of developers' time. And it's sometimes easy to think, oh, well, we can just change the code later. It's the web, we can update things. But there's really sort of a massive inefficiency to that just always ends up wasting time. It lowers the quality of the code that comes out of a project like that. So the results might look okay, but the code will almost always be worse for it, which means that it's harder to maintain, it costs more to maintain, and ultimately the lifespan of that website will be shorter because of that. And so it really does things justice if you don't do that. This leads right into the notion of just simply being on time. And while it's another sort of obvious thing, another obvious point, I really think it's critical to think about because it's so hard to be on time. Keep in mind that your developer is really totally at the end of the chain. Everybody before them comes, including sales, the writers for a site, the designers for a site, clients have to approve everything. The developer is literally at the complete and utter end of the chain. And so every time somebody is a day late or whatever at any stage, usually this all ends up squeezing down on the developer. I've only worked in a few situations where whenever something was delayed, usually because of a client, it actually pushed the launch date out. Usually the launch date stays the same no matter how crunched it gets. So the developers really get squeezed on time. And there's a whole bunch of negative impacts to this that you don't quite realize. For one, it obviously builds a very bad dynamic between the two teams, because if everybody's always late, the designer is the last person to touch things right before it hands off to the developer. So do your best to be on time. If it'll really help to build a positive relationship there. Another impact that this has that I think is kind of unseen until you see really the opposite effect is that if you're always on time and your developer comes to know, okay, no matter what happens, my designers are really going to do their best to get things to me on time. Well, suddenly they might be more motivated to provide feedback or suggestions that would feel like they would lengthen the design cycle, but they know you're going to get to them on time, so they're kind of willing to do those things. Whereas if you're always squeezing the developer to just kind of crank it out like a machine, then you don't leave any room for them to provide any extra bonus value, if you will, to the actual end product. So creating sort of that relationship with them is definitely a huge way to build definitely goodwill, but then eventually a much more positive interaction that leads to fundamentally better websites. So finally, number 10 here is to simply stick around. Many companies even are set up such that once a designer finishes a project, they hand over the designs to the developer to be built, and they are immediately assigned to some other project that consumes all of their time, and there's almost little or no time maybe left to allocate towards kind of helping out as things go. So just make yourself available. Figure out ways to stick around, if you will, because the odds are that you haven't planned for everything, that there's going to be some unleft element or design widget that will need to be created. And so this just generates a more kind of an ongoing cycle between you and the developer where you help them finish the website. So this might start off just as simple as putting reminders on your calendar to remind yourself to follow up. And eventually, I think, if you really kind of stick with some of these things, sticking around won't be hard because you'll be friends with the developers and you'll be really working together so effectively that you'll want to be a part of that, and you'll really actually even start to understand the code or how things are done, and it can just ultimately lead to a much more positive, forward-moving environment. And I definitely think that these sorts of things, such as sticking around and all these other elements, really ultimately lead to such a more positive environment that it just is more fun to work in. And I really do believe it'll add more value to yourself as an individual. So that is all I have for today, and I appreciate you joining me here. And as I mentioned, here's my personal email account if you want to get in touch. I know we are going to answer some questions that Grace has been taking, so we'll definitely do that. But if we don't get to your question, or if you just want to email me something that feels unrelated, feel free to shoot me an email.
Great. Yeah, and we have about 20 minutes left for your questions. So if you've got any questions or comments for Patrick, feel free to type them in the questions panel on the right of your screen. I've got one question for you, Patrick. You mentioned that the importance of bringing in the development team early on in the process. And I was thinking for websites that are embracing some of the new technologies like responsive design, that would be especially important, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, because you're not going to be able to forge kind of a road like that on your own. You're going to really, if you're pushing the envelope at all, you're really going to need the developer to maybe help guide you. And yeah, if you set up if you have a negative environment where you're just constantly getting no's, it's obviously not going to work very well. So building more cutting-edge products is definitely possible as you build a better relationship.
Absolutely. Now, I know you also mentioned the concept of how egos are often, the root behind kind of conflicts between the creative and development teams. How would you recommend that a team deal with, revisions that, like they seem like they are really needed from the creative side, but the development side pushes back? How do you deal with issues like that?
You mean like just the egos in particular?
The egos in particular, and also, those situations where there's, a real disagreement about, revisions having to be made to the site beyond what, the designers can do.
Yeah. It's always difficult. I think maybe I know I didn't clarify actually really well the whole, my thoughts on egos in general. Um, and just from personal experience, the best thing you can do to impact someone else's either negative opinion or inflated ego is to address your own. So the more, the more I try to not think that I'm the cat's meow, the more I'm open to what other people are doing. And at first, this kind of sets you up to be walked over a little bit. But I think that ultimately it just, if I don't know, it's like if someone's acting crazy towards you and you respond by acting crazy, then you're like just as crazy as they are, You're not really ahead of anything. So if you respond to someone acting crazy with calm, diplomatic perspective, then it's only going to expose sort of the fact that they're saying no all the time, or that they just arbitrarily try to fight things. And I think that's really where understanding the technology can help out a lot, is that you'll know when they're BSing you and when they're actually kind of speaking the truth. And so to me, that sort of thing really is a sort of a long, ongoing thing where you just have to build that relationship with them. And quite often you'll get situations where you want to go back and you're like, man, I really want to like fix that up and tweak it. And you're right to think so, and it's oftentimes easily justified, but you got to keep in mind the world that they're in. And if you build that good relationship, you might come to find out, for example, that the development team is just so stinking swamped that they don't even have the time to read your emails, much less actually address everything that you might want. And so, there's all sorts of reasons, especially for internal teams where budgets are limited. In the agency world where you're selling websites, the web development and the web designers are the people making the money for the company. So it's much easier to get a hold of them to make updates and changes, whereas internal teams just really can struggle with that because of just being overworked. So I think there's definitely a sense of working together and just, at times doing the best you can with what you have.
Sure. We've got a question from someone in the audience. She says, the handoff stage is something that can't happen all at once. What can we do to make the string-along files go along easier? So I guess she's referring to,
Sure.
a design that can't be completely finished before it gets sent along to development.
Yeah, so I worked on one great example of that. I helped wrote all the code years ago for the Cold Stone Creamery website, and it was huge. Every stinking section seemed to have custom design content. I mean, there was just like mountains of design comps eventually, and it was not nearly all done ahead of time, but the core elements were. And I think as a designer, the best thing you can do is make sure that you nail down the overall structure. So the header and sidebars and footers and things, so that you know that you're not, and like refuse to change those. Because if you change those later on in a subsequent comp, it's going to just confuse the heck out of things, because then your developers can be like, whoa, you like changed the header a little bit. Is it just for this section? Is it for the whole site? Like, how does that work? And so just getting it as far as you can is really important. I would say that at minimum, you should be able to deliver a homepage and at least kind of a standard content layout. From there, a lot of times, it's the actual content inside of that layout that ultimately has to be custom designed. So that would be my suggestion, is just don't settle for just the home page, because so seldom, the content pages, or most often, I guess, the content pages will look very different from the home page.
We've got a question kind of along the same lines. How can a designer handle a developer who says a needed feature is, quote, too much work and therefore shouldn't be done, even when there isn't a deadline pressing on them? It's a situation where the designer feels like that's the easy way out, and the business leaders are saying it's not possible, but they're trying to get the best end results for the user.
Yeah, so I used to work at an agency, and I was unfortunately that obnoxious guy. And it's like, no matter what feature they asked me, I'd say it cost $10,000, and that just it was kind of a joke. It was like, no matter what they asked for, it was going to cost $10,000. And sometimes they bought it, and sometimes they didn't. So it's kind of comical, but it's the problem as a developer is sometimes, I don't know, it's kind of like anything. I could say, hey, can you design me a logo for $100? And you'd say, well, no, I can't design you a logo for $100. It costs $10,000 to do all the research and blah 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 blah. Maybe $10,000 isn't even enough. But the truth is, you could sit down and design a logo in an hour. So, like, it's kind of the same problem. I could code something really quickly and sloppily or whatever, and perhaps in maybe a day to do some feature, but to do it really right and without sort of creating a nightmare, it may take a lot of time. And so sometimes that's one situation, right, where they always make it out to be more than it is, but I really think there's usually kind of a root cause. Either the developer doesn't know how to do it, which is obviously a realistic and almost an okay problem. I mean, they just need to admit it. But a lot of times they're just overworked. There's just too much to do, and they can't keep up on things. So it's like, how do you ultimately fight that? I think the best way to fight that is to understand as much code as possible. And so as you learn to code a little bit yourself, you'll really either start to see, wow, they're right, that really is a pain in the neck, or you'll be like, no, I've seen tutorials on how to do this. It's not that hard. But ultimately, I mean, if you are sort of the positive catalyst in that equation, then it just makes that person look ultimately worse and worse as a person that's just stonewalling things for no reason. So if there isn't a reason behind, kind of what you're seeing, then, you kind of go up the food chain and push for what you need or want.
So was your $10,000 answer, was that just kind of a litmus test to see if there was something that was really needed or just something that was a fleeting fancy?
Kind of both. It worked as both. But I mean, a lot, they'd be like, oh, well, we want a movie on the homepage with animated, wine bottle, or it was a company we did lots of Bacardi brands. So we want this rum bottle to slide in and splash and a lemon to fall in the cup or something. You know what I mean? I'd be like, $10,000. You know what I mean? So it's kind of, I mean, it can be a litmus test to see if they're serious, or it can just be, blowing smoke because I don't have any idea. Like, I don't know how much that would cost. I'd have to, it'd take a lot of work to figure out what that would cost. So.
We do have one suggestion from the audience on how to get those things pushed through. Bribing developers with chocolate. Not a terrible idea.
It's diplomatic. I think that's just, to me, that's the whole idea of taking the egos out of things. It's just being diplomatic and working to better things instead of adding to the nightmare.
And also, I feel like, approaching things with a positive attitude where you aren't going into the situation or the conversation with a predisposed notion like, oh, man, I can't believe I have to go talk to Steve again. This is going to be awful. And surely, if you go in there with that type of feeling, he's going to pick up on that and think, oh, God, it's Dave again, and he's going to act like I don't know what I'm doing. And,
Yep.
Yeah.
And it can take a long time to unwind those situations.
Certainly.
So.
We've got a question here. Do you expect a web standards document to accompany final files from a designer?
Web standards in, like, what regard, I wonder?
That's a good question. Linda, if you can clarify what exactly you mean by that, we will attempt to answer your question.
A style guide is pretty common, I guess, like where maybe your main designs accommodate for certain sort of specific styles, but then to ultimately have just sort of a standard, like, here's what all the various levels of heading tags will be looking like, here's what a paragraph looks, because sometimes if you're doing a really visually rich design, you might find that maybe an e-commerce site, you find that you don't really have any, need to design up front, like kind of a standard, what's a page full of copy and images look like for the about section or something. And so, just providing some real basic styles like a style guide can really empower your developers to kind of make a more complete solution.
Yeah, Linda clarified that she was thinking of a document outlining type styling, color palette, grid details, etc.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing that is just awesome to get, because then you're getting it right. You don't have to wonder or guess or whatever, and it kind of plays into the whole idea of having greater control. If you don't provide them with those assets, then you're at their mercy. So, like, personally, I've cut tons of designs and coded them, but I understand design, so I don't really have any problem interpreting those, right? Like, that's actually one of the benefits, is that I can work with the design team that maybe is always crunched for time because they're doing so many projects. I can say, look, you just get them to a point, and I can finish it as I code it, you know what I mean, and accommodate for some of those things. But if you find that your development team just really does what you give them, then you just, if you don't prepare for it, then you're going to find things on your site that you don't like. So.
Mm-hmm. Now we've got a question from a person who seems like has been dealing with a lot of these interdepartmental conflicts. He says that at his company there's some confusion about who is really responsible for what, and the CEO directly reaches out to user interface artists to get mock-ups, which then get announced to the engineers after the fact, which strains relationships. And he wonders, would simply getting a product development manager to call the shots help in this type of situation?
Yeah, it's almost like the CEO or whoever it is that's doing it just needs to be educated on kind of the problem that he's creating, like that it creates a bad dynamic. And yeah, there's huge benefits to having that technical guy in the room just to say, no, you can't really do that, or, oh yeah, that's super easy, we can do that all day long. And you might think you know some of these things, but you'd be surprised how infinite a number of situations there are that can create yes or no situations. So, I mean, honestly, it depends on the, was it the owner of the company or just the CEO or something?
No, it's the CEO, yeah.
It just, I mean, it kind of depends on how approachable they are. And maybe if we can't address them, then the person that they're coming to before, could immediately turn around and go say, hey, I just got this request from the CEO. I'm going to work up some designs. Just want to know if you approach the technical team. Be like, I just want to know if you guys had any feedback before I got started on that. Just to show that at least they're being diplomatic. Now, if you're the technical team on the end, then you're sort of, you're stuck unless you just challenge things and try to push your way back up. So.
And it kind of sounds to me like maybe there's not a standard process for starting a project in this situation. It seems like the type of thing where, if a random executive is just saying, hey, we need this, and approaches a person who, is one small piece of it but doesn't really let anybody else know about the project, that just seems like a big old traffic jam. And, perhaps getting a project development manager, or at least some manager who has experience in project management, to streamline the process and just kind of create a workflow that everyone can adhere to.
Yeah, totally. That's huge. I mean, it'd be like building a house and the homeowner shows up and talks to one of the carpenters and moves a door. And the carpenter can do it. Yeah, he can go do it. But then everybody else is like, what the heck? The door's in the wrong spot. So.
Exactly. So we've got about 5 minutes left. If you have any more questions for Patrick, you can type them in the questions box. Thanks for everyone who's been asking really good, hard questions. The person who submitted the last question has replied. He liked our answer and said, I hate to tell them I told them so, but that's what I get to do.
That's pretty funny.
Now, do you have any advice for, maybe there are some people who are on the management side here rather than being kind of in the trenches designers? What advice would you have for them?
Whew, that's tough. Yeah, if you're on the outside looking in at this.
Yeah, and having to, maybe you were the go-between between those two groups, or, you're managing a team of designers who then has to work with the manager of developers.
Wow. Boy, that is tough. That would be a hard spot to be in. I'd imagine, I'm having to think here for a second. I think the best bet would, in many ways, just to force them to get together. And if you're, as a manager, if you understand both sides yourself, if you get the design but you also get the development, it seems like your best bet is to really just start calling some people out for what they're doing and force people to get together. Insist that they brainstorm together or that they work together on certain things, and start to sort of bridge that gap. And actually, as their manager, you could approach the design team and say, hey, look, I want you guys to all start learning HTML and CSS. And then you go to the development team and say, look, a mandatory part of your job now is to learn some basics of design. And so as manager, you can kind of maybe force some of that or encourage it. It might even come in the form of not saying that that's what they have to do, but getting, paying someone to come in to even speak to the developers to teach them some basic design ideas. I think you could put a real positive spin on just encouraging both sides to learn better what the other side does. And with that, just ultimately becomes a little bit, or ultimately comes a little bit of respect and better relations. So.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I mean, everyone, I imagine that most managers really love to be able to offer some type of professional development, alongside the regular 9 to 5 or whatever. And there's so many resources out there for both designers and for web developers. That would be, I think that would be a wonderful step to take.
One interesting tactic I've actually seen is to take, like maybe have one of the developers create a presentation that they would then present to the entire team, both designers and developers, about some important new technology or something that affects the work that they're doing directly, and can just really start to help educate, in that case, like the designers, on things that really specifically impact the development team. Because each niche or each business is going to have sort of certain kind of issues that they deal with, and new technologies or new practices or whatever are going to impact them in different ways. And so it can be a really kind of a great way to get everybody just sort of talking together instead of, existing on separate floors of a building and never talking to each other.
I like that a lot, and the idea is kind of DIY too. The cost would certainly be low. Simply, having little, lunchtime roundtables, or an afternoon when you get together and share some presentations, or brainstorming sessions even.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are just about out of time. Thank you very much to everyone who attended today and asked questions, and of course, thanks a lot to Patrick McNeil.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
All right, thanks very much.